Greg Sinnett, thesis defense. Greg, this is the end of Greg's 6th year, and Greg came to us from Maine, from the University of Maine, where he did both his bachelor's and his master's degree. And Greg is going to tell us today about all different types of aspects about the nearshore heat budget. So the format of this is most of you have been to many thesis defenses. It's going to be the same. Greg is going to talk to us for about 45 minutes, 50 minutes. And then we're going to have open questions from the audience. What I would suggest is, unless you have just a burning question, hold your questions until the end. And then afterwards, everyone except for Greg and his thesis committee, everyone's going to leave except for Greg and his thesis committee. And then we're going to have a nice chat amongst ourselves. And then, regardless of the outcome, there's going to be a reception at Surfside afterwards. And so, without further ado, Greg.
Great. Thank you, Falk, and thanks all for being here. I'm going to try to speak loudly, so if you can't hear me in the back, just raise your hand or something, and I'll try to pipe up. We're going to talk about the nearshore heat budget, but before I start, I would like to recognize also the committee, Peter Frank, Sarah Giddings, Drew Lucas, and Eugene Pawlak as well, and funding from NSF, Scripps, and Sea Grant. So here we are. This is the nearshore. This is Scripps Pier just offshore here. And this is the surf zone where waves are breaking, and the inner shelf just offshore where waves are not breaking. And together, these comprise the nearshore. So this is the region we're going to be talking about. Why study the nearshore? Well, it's important. For example, coastal areas account for a large part of the world's gross national product. And you might not be surprised to find it's polluted. There's an example here from 2014 where 1 million excess illnesses from bathers in waters off of Orange County alone. So why study temperature in the nearshore? Well, if you're concerned about water quality, temperature affects both pathogen ecology and sunlight, which is related to temperature, as we'll see later on, also kills fecal bacteria. Temperature is also important for a whole variety of biological reasons. For example, egg production, development rates, recruitment rates of various species are dependent on temperature. But also temperature is an indicator of physical processes that we care about in the nearshore. And I'll illustrate this with an example. This is a heat budget for a variety of coral reefs. Basically what's going on here are the investigators observed the temperature change on the reefs and compared that to the temperature change they expect from a variety of physical processes that are going on the reef. So they can measure solar heating, evaporation, conduction, transport, etc., all of these processes. They'll put that into a model and see how well their model of what they expect the temperature change to be compares with what is actually observed. And they can tell something about the physical processes going on in the reef that they wouldn't otherwise have known. So we can do this to the nearshore, but there's something missing, and that's the surf zone. Typically, when you do, or when people have done nearshore heat budgets, they'll either assume that the surf zone is behaving similar to the nearshore, or they'll neglect it altogether. And that may not be the best thing to do. Here's an example from a simulation run in the inner shelf and the surf zone. This is temperature. And what I'm showing you is an example of some rip currents that are exchanging water between the inner shelf and the surf zone. This is the surface of the water. This is a cross-sectional view of temperature. And what you see is that the inner shelf is stratified, but the surf zone is well mixed. And these are waters of different temperature, and that sets things like buoyancy and density and things. So the exchange of water between these two regions depends on temperature, which may not be the same in the surf zone as it is in the inner shelf. So we're going to talk about some things about the surf zone heat budget, basics, like what are the dominant heat budget terms. I'm going to place them in context and expand them to describe a variety of surf zones, generalize these results, and then talk about some physical processes, and one in particular, that's internal wave run-up into the surf zone. So I'll fit the outline of my talk around these kind of motivating topics. The first chapter is on a general surf zone heat budget. The second chapter is about wave-induced albedo. I'll explain more about that. But these are two kind of dominant terms in the surf zone heat budget. Next, we'll look at the competing effective waves in the surf zone and expand that to some generalized surf zones. And lastly, we'll talk about internal waves. So we'll start with the surf zone heat budget. This is work that was done and published in 2014 in GRL. We're going to have two goals here in this chapter: to observe a unique heating contribution, that from wave heating, and I'll show you what that is. And we'll also quantify some other surf zone heat fluxes that we observed from this experiment. So here's the experiment. This is Scripps Pier again. This is where the experiment took place. For a period of about from June 6th to July 23rd, 2014, we deployed 7 thermistors about a meter below mean tide level at various cross-shore locations along the pier. These were attached to the pier. And these thermistors measured temperature. Additionally, at the end of the pier, we measured the waves, air temperature, humidity, wind, solar radiation, and tide. So we can get a variety of other heat flux terms as well to construct a heat budget. So let's do that. Here's the heat budget. This is the partition between the surf zone and the inner shelf. And so the heat content in the surf zone that's measured by the thermistors changes as a result of fluxes through the air-sea boundary. Those include the solar shortwave radiation, long-wave radiation, latent heat, and sensible heat exchange applied over the entire width of the surf zone. There's also an advective component that exchanges water between the surf zone and inner shelf. The difference in heat between those two water masses that are exchanged can transport heat as well. And also, there's an additional term that we'll explore. We're going to call it wave heating, and that's a heat flux that's unique to the surf zone where waves are breaking. Okay, so what's wave heating? Outside in the outer surf zone, waves break, and as they make their way across the surf zone, they decrease in height. So that a surfer that's bouncing around out here feels a lot of energy, but someone walking along the beach here doesn't feel much energy. And that's because the energy in the waves is related to their height. That makes the flux of energy that's entering the surf zone, the energy of the waves at the outer surf zone, times the group velocity of the waves. So that's the flux of wave energy that enters the surf zone. This flux of energy does a whole bunch of things in the surf zone. It makes turbulence, it drives currents, it trains bubbles, it lifts sediment. There's lots of motion happening in the surf zone because of this energy. But all of that energy, through viscous dissipation, eventually goes to heat. And so we'll talk about what that means in the context of the heat flux terms that we observe. So these are the solar, long wave, latent, and sensible heat terms shown here for the entire duration of the experiment. The solar radiation is the blue thing here that's going up and down as the sun rises and sets. The long wave, latent, and sensible heat exchange, also through the surface of the water, are mostly down here. That's the green, black, and magenta curves down here. This surf zone specific term that we're talking about, the wave heating term, is this red curve here. And where waves are large, where there's some wave events here, this term becomes significant. And it's contributing to a heat source in the surf zone. All of these fluxes together we'll call the net heat flux. That's the total heat flux contribution to the surf zone. And we can construct a heat budget from this. We'll look at the net heating flux from those terms versus the observed change in heat content that was measured by the thermistors. So here's the heat budget. And what I've done in this heat budget is split this net heat flux contribution up into some bins, average the bins, and that's the dots here. The dots fall along the one-to-one line here, which means that we're explaining most of the observed heat variation using these fluxes on diurnal and longer timescales. So that's where our heat budget closes. These lines here are the standard deviation in each band. So there's a lot of variability in these in this heat flux that's not explained. And we can see what's going on if we kind of lift the hood of the net heat flux here and look at each term individually. The solar heat flux term is the largest term. This is the mean and the standard deviation of that solar heat flux term. Here's the wave heating term that's unique to the surf zone. So it's contributing almost a quarter of the largest term in the heat flux. And it has the second highest variability of all of the heat flux terms. The latent, sensible, and long wave are net heat sinks to the surf zone during this time. And if we compare that with the observed change in heat, this is the mean observed change in heat. So during the beginning of summer, the surf zone was slightly warming. There's also a lot of extra variability that we saw here that's not explained with these terms, the observed heat fluxes. So we can construct a little equation here where the residual is what we have to add to our observed heat fluxes to fully balance the observed heat content change. And this residual is a net heat sink and a lot of variability. And that's going to motivate a lot of the rest of this talk. Basically, there's unaccounted for heat flux reduction, so what's causing that? And there's unaccounted for variance in this primitive heat budget. So what's responsible for that? So we'll summarize this primitive heat budget by saying that the wave energy entering the surf zone is a flux of heat that's about 23% of the largest term in this heat budget. So it's potentially a significant contribution to the surf zone heat budget. The largest term in this heat budget was the solar short-wave radiation. And so we can go back here and remind ourselves about the residual. If the solar short-wave radiation is the largest term in the heat budget, well, maybe we can adjust, maybe there's something happening to this, this term that can cause an adjustment here. And I say that because if I take this line away, you can still see where the surf zone is. And that's because the surf zone looks white. It's reflecting a lot more solar radiation than the offshore region where it's dark. This is the albedo, the reflectivity of the sea surface. And there's very few observations of surf zone albedo. In fact, there's only 20 minutes of data from February 9th, 1994, taken up the Scripps Pier. But that's instructive. We can look at that and see that in the inner shelf, where waves are not breaking, the measured reflectance versus time, this is 60 seconds worth of data, is fairly low. This is about 0.01 to about 0.08. So there's not much reflectivity in the inner shelf. In the surf zone, however, these scales are different. This is now 0.2 to 0.6. So the reflectivity is much larger in the surf zone. And you can actually see the waves. These are 10-second period waves that are causing the albedo difference here. But aside from these really sparse observations, there's really no observations of surf zone albedo. It's really unobserved. And we also don't know what its influence might be to surf zone heat budgets. So that motivates chapter 2, the wave-induced albedo effects on the surf zone heat budget. So here we go. This is work that was done, published in 2016. And we're going to ask two kind of motivating questions here. We're going to look at the surf zone albedo and try to quantify that using observations. And we're also going to develop some parameterizations for surf zone albedo. So as I said, albedo is the reflectivity of the sea surface. And reflectivity of the ocean is not unique. It's well known that the albedo of the open ocean depends on the solar zenith angle. That's the angle the sun makes from vertical. And there are many parameterizations that include this component. It's also well known that white capping, foam on top of the surface, increases albedo. Usually in the open ocean, that's done through white capping, when there's large winds. So there are some parameterizations that also parameterize albedo as a function of both the solar zenith angle and wind speed to also account for white capping. But as we saw in the surf zone, you don't need wind to generate foam. So we'd like to ask the question, can there be a parameterization then that accounts for solar zenith angle and the amount of foam itself? So that's what we're after. This is an experiment done October 25th to October 25th, 2014 to 2015. So a year's worth of data. Where we deployed a radiometer on the side of the pier here. This is what the radiometer looked like. And it's a big ugly mess to deploy it. So tons of thanks to everyone who helped. This is Brian hanging off the side of the pier. And this is me trying to look helpful while Falk takes the picture. But it's really a pain to do. So what is the albedo? What does the radiometer measure then? We're looking at the albedo. The albedo is related to the downwelling component of the solar radiation. And it's also measuring at the same time the reflected upwelling component of the solar shortwave radiation. The ratio of these two is the albedo. So this radiometer is getting a direct measure of the albedo in the surf zone. What's left over is what heats the water. So that's what can be thought to contribute to the heat budget. That expression is here. And we can see how that's working. This is a GoPro image of the surf zone looking down over the radiometer. Here it is. The radiometer is this little thing out here. And so I'm going to show you a bunch of images from this GoPro stitched together as a movie. At the same time, I show you the output from the albedo, from the radiometer. So here's the albedo measured by the radiometer as a function of time. This black line is the open ocean parameterization for albedo. So this is what you would expect if there were no waves breaking. And as I play this movie and waves crash underneath the radiometer, I hope you can see that the albedo is peaking. It's becoming much greater than what you would expect there to be if there were no waves. So in an average sense then, the surf zone has a higher albedo, it would seem, and it's certainly related to the waves. We can expand this quick little 70 seconds worth of data. We have data for an entire year. So I can show that to you here. These are now 1-minute averages of the measured albedo for the entire year. There's a lot of detail that's missed here, but I just want to highlight the fact that there's a large range in observed albedo. And at times, the radiometer was not sampling the surf zone. So either the waves were small, the tide was high. So if I remove times when the radiometer was not sampling the surf zone, this is now the surf zone albedo, only when the radiometer was over the surf zone. And that average is about 0.15, which is significantly larger, about 2.5 times as large as what you would expect from the offshore where waves are not breaking in their shelf. So that's great. These observations are really handy. We can tell a lot from them. But I mean, there's a better way, because this is a bear. Like, it was really a pain. And not only that, but you have to clean it all the time and just make sure that things are working right. So that motivates some parameterizations. So we can do this 2 ways. There's one way that we'll call wave model parameterization. We can take wave statistics from the end of the pier and bathymetry that's measured along the pier, and use these two as inputs to the parameterization to derive the albedo at cross-shore locations. I don't have time to talk about this one, but I do have time to talk about a second way we can parameterize the albedo using images. So I use the GoPro images of the surf zone. Basically, the time resolution is only limited by your shutter speed with this parameterization. And what you get out is an area averaged albedo, the area being the field of view of the camera. So we can get the albedo that way. And I'll show you an example. Here are 2 images at the top here. This is an image where waves are breaking, and here's an image where waves are not breaking. What we'll do is we'll do a little bit of image processing to convert this to grayscale. So now all of these pictures or pixels are in black and white, essentially. The pixel coloration in grayscale is ranked from 0 being black to 255 being bright white. And we can create, essentially this is a PDF. It's basically the number of counts that are in this image at a given pixel brightness. And so the pixels fall along a range for each image. And we can highlight a region where we expect the pixel brightness to be about that of foam. So in this blue area here, this is the brightness that we expect foam to be. And we can take a simple fraction and say the amount of pixels that are foam looking compared to the total amount of pixels is related to the fractional coverage of the sea surface that's covered in foam. And so obviously there's much more foam here than here. And so that's how we differentiate in this parameterization. We can construct the albedo from that by simply saying that the albedo is a combination of the area of the surf zone that's covered in foam times the albedo of pure foam. plus a contribution from the area of the surf zone that's not covered in foam times the albedo of the open ocean. And so that makes the combined image parameterized albedo. And we can see how we did. This is the observed albedo versus the image parameterized albedo, and it falls very close to the one-to-one line with high skill. From this, we can also get a best fit of the albedo of pure foam, which is a nice little sidebar, which is about 0.465. So we're doing pretty well with this parameterization, and I just want to highlight the fact that because this is image-based, we can take images really quickly, and we can actually resolve individual waves. So this is the albedo versus time in seconds down here. For the image-based parameterization in red, the observed albedo from the radiometer in black, and in the dotted here is what we'd expect the open ocean where there's no wave breaking to be. And we track the radiometer really well with this parameterization. Okay, so we'll summarize chapter 2 now. In this chapter, we looked at an adjustment to the shortwave radiation, that being the albedo of the surf zone, which is about 2.5 times higher on average than the albedo in the inner shelf. So this is a reduction in the surf zone to the solar shortwave radiation component of the heat budget. We did that 2 ways. We parameterized this 2 ways as well, using an image. And I didn't show you the wave model, but the wave model resolves the cross-shore distribution, or cross-shore average albedo. So that's great. Some of you probably want your money back now, because in chapter 1, I told you that wave dissipation heats the surf zone. And in chapter 2, I just told you that breaking wave foam reduces a component of the heat flux. So what is it? Like, what's going on? And for that, we'll look at chapter 3, which is the combined effects of these waves. We'll look at these combined effects, and then we'll generalize to a variety of surf zones and different locations. This is work that's in prep now for JGR. And we've got 2 goals for this chapter. We're going to quantify the relative contribution of the albedo reduction versus the wave heating components. And we'll make predictions for surf zones, specifically with varying slopes and locations. For this chapter, we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to take an average over the entire surf zone. So basically, that means the wave energy flux that we observe out here, and in the chapter 1 wave heating term, we're going to divide by the length of the surf zone, basically take a surf zone average now, so that the heat flux is now expressed in watts per square meter of surf zone. The solar radiation component that's observed, let's see, what was that? Some of it's reflected by the albedo, the reflectivity of the surface, leaving the rest of it to penetrate. And what I showed you in chapter 2 is that the reflectivity is different in the surf zone. So more solar radiation is being reflected, less is being absorbed. And so this difference then between the amount of solar radiation absorbed in the surf zone and the amount of solar radiation absorbed where waves are not breaking on the inner shelf, we'll call the albedo-related reduction in solar heating. That also has units of watts per square meter of surf zone. So these are the 2 terms that we'll be comparing in this chapter. Observations, again, for the entire year between October 25th, 2014 to 2015. And I want to take you through some of these observations just to highlight some of the variability that we observed in some key terms. The solar radiation, the downwelling component of the solar radiation is in black. So these little marks here are for each day. So the sun rises and sets. So these are little bumps here. I've also put the solar radiation at the top of the atmosphere, the daily max of that value, the daily maximum top of the atmosphere solar radiation here, to highlight the seasonal variability, the diurnal variability in the downwelling component is here, and also there's variability on minutes to days due to clouds. So sometimes there's clouds that reduce the solar radiation a little bit more. Clouds are plotted here. So the atmosphere attenuates some of this signal naturally. So there's about 25% attenuation from the top of the atmosphere to what the radiometer would observe on a clear day. And clouds increase that further. On seasonal, here's the winter. Spring is relatively cloud-free. The summer, we get some June gloom, so there's coastal fog that reduces that radiation as well. And on synoptic timescales, so 2 to 10-day timescales as clouds come and go. The wave height is plotted here. This is also seasonally and synoptic variation. Winter, there's some storms or large waves. Springtime storms as well. Summer is usually less wave activity. So these together combine to give a surf zone width. So surf zone width is a function of the wave height, the bathymetry, and the tides. And so that's plotted here. This is the surf zone width. It's about 80 meters, plus or minus a bunch, depending on wave height and all of these things. The wave heating term depends on the wave energy flux, which is plotted here, and the length of the surf zone. So both of these go into the wave heating surf zone average term. And the last term, these two are the things that we'll be comparing. The albedo-related reduction in solar heating is a function of the downwelling component of solar radiation and the difference in albedo between the inner shelf and the surf zone. The surf zone average albedo I've plotted here. Okay, so now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's talk about the relationship between the wave energy flux, the wave heating term, and the albedo-related reduction in solar heating. And that I've plotted here. This is the wave heating on the x-axis of all of these plots. This is the albedo-related reduction in solar heating on the y-axis here. The color bar is related to the cloudiness. Basically, the white dots here are clear, and the black dots here are cloudy days. These are all daily average values. And there's no correlation here between the wave heating term and the albedo-related reduction. But I've broken these out by season, so winter, spring, summer, and fall, to show you how these two terms are interrelated in terms of how they are affected by seasons. Here's a little visual aid to help you kind of understand what's heating and what's cooling. The wave heating term is doing the heating. So the larger this gets, the hotter things are getting. The more heating is being added to the surf zone. The larger you get with this term, the less solar heating there is. That's kind of a relative cooling term. So you can think of it that way. And the one-to-one line is here. So in the winter, stuff down here is a net heating contribution to the surf zone heat flux. Up here, this is a net reduction in heating to the surf zone heat flux. And so what I want to highlight is in winter, these are, there's both going on. But in spring, when the downwelling component of solar radiation is much larger, most of the days are falling up on this side of the graph. So there's mostly a net reduction in heating in spring. Only during the largest wave events is there ever any heating. A similar story in summer here. Now the waves are lower, and only during the cloudiest days would you ever expect there to be a net heating from this term in the summer. On average, the net heating is about 28 watts per square meter in the surf zone, plus or minus 11. And the net reduction in solar heating due to albedo is about 41 watts per square meter, plus or minus 16. So that's what's happening on average. And this is all nice to know for scripts here. But what happens if we want to know what these two relative terms are doing somewhere else? And for that, we're going to apply this to an idealized surf zone. So I'll make a flat bathymetry here with a known bathymetric slope and apply some well-known surf zone scalings. So this is the significant wave height. This is a breaking parameter, which together can give the depth of breaking. And that's also related to the bathymetric slope times the surf zone length. So we can get all of these things from these typical scalings, which may adjust the location of the surf zone a little bit, However, making these scalings, we can get a really interesting result in that the surf zone averaged foam fraction, you recall back from the parameterization that the zeta here is the fraction of surface covered in foam. Well, this is just a simple value here where m is a constant scaling parameter we get from the wave-derived albedo parameterization. This is a constant. And gamma is a constant, that's the breaking parameter. And this only depends then on the bathymetric slope, which is a really interesting result. We can go a little bit further and say that the ratio of the albedo-related reduction in solar heating to the total downwelling component of solar radiation is this relationship here. This we just saw was a constant. This is the foam fraction. This is the albedo of pure foam, which we got from the best fit of our albedo observations. That's also a constant. This is the albedo of the inner shelf. And this varies on a daily time scale, but on a daily average, this is also constant. So this whole thing is a constant ratio on a daily average, which is a pretty interesting little tidbit. We can take this even further and say that what we really want to know is the relationship between the albedo-related reduction in solar heating and the wave heating term. So we want to know the relationship between these two. And that's this mess, which is actually not that bad, because all of this stuff in the brackets is constant. These are all constant terms, leaving this ratio as the only driver for what determines whether albedo-related reduction or wave heating dominate. This is the downwelling component of solar radiation, and this is the significant wave height at breaking. These are related to the radiation at the top of the atmosphere. That's easily known just from geometry. Clouds, which we can get from, say, MODIS, like the optical depth of the atmosphere. And this is the significant wave height at breaking, which is a commonly observed parameter as well. So this is encouraging. And what we'd like to do is to apply our results, what we actually observed from these two terms, to these scalings. So here I've plotted the ratio of these two terms versus the significant wave height at breaking. And these are the observations now. So this is essentially, think of this like a 2D histogram, where these are the normalized number of counts. So the number of observations that fall in this parameter space. Down here, below 1 is where the Q wave term dominates. Above 1 is where the albedo-related reduction dominates. So this is the cooling, this is the heating. And if I apply our scalings to this now, we can see how we're doing. I've done this for a case where there's no clouds. So imagining that no clouds exist. And I've done this twice, once for summer in black, solid, and once for winter in dotted. And so if there were no clouds in our observations, we would expect our observations to fall between these two curves. The fact that there are clouds means that occasionally we have observations that fall down below these curves. But the summer curve provides a really nifty upper bound for these observations. And so we can see that we're fitting well into this parameter space and that these scalings are encouraging, I guess. We can apply this now to other locations. So if we go to the equator and say, well, what do we expect here? There's hardly any seasons at the equator, so winter and summer look very similar. And we would expect, if there are no clouds, the observations to fall between these two red curves. With clouds, they might fall below. We can go to the Arctic Circle or near the Arctic Circle. That's the blue curve. In the summer and in winter, again, there's hardly any sun. So now the solar component is almost nil. And so this kind of defines a parameter space where we would expect the relative contribution of these two terms to fall. Okay, so let's summarize this quickly. We've been talking about two terms, the wave heating term and the solar shortwave term, and the adjustment to each. We saw through observations of these two terms that the wave heating contribution is about 28 watts per square meter of surf zone, and the net reduction or the albedo-related reduction in solar heating is about 41 watts per square meter of surf zone. And that these two vary depending on the solar radiation, clouds, and wave height. And that if you go to different regions, the relative contribution of these two might change. So now what about the residual that we observed in chapter 1? Let's go back and revisit that, because there's one term here in this heat budget that we haven't spent a lot of time talking about, and that's the advective term of this heat budget. And it's potentially a large term, contributing both to the mean and the standard and variation of the heat content. And in particular, I'll highlight internal waves. And internal waves are well observed. This is a temperature record at Scripps Pier from 1973, so Clint Winnett's work. This is a temperature record 1 meter above the bottom at pier end. And so I hope you can see that, you know, temperature flagging along, and there's some high variability, and we're going along, and there's, you know, really, really steep temperature variation at this location. This is 2 degrees C with variability lasting, you know, on the orders of hours. So internal waves are observed, but how they propagate far onshore, how they might affect the surf zone, and how they evolve onshore as they propagate is not well known and not well observed. So that's what we'll focus on here in chapter 4. We're going to characterize some of the internal wave run-up to the surf zone. And in particular, we'd like to observe some internal wave events in very shallow water, because that's not been done very frequently. And we'll quantify their upslope evolution, because that's very rare as well. So here we are. This is the experiment location. This is the Scripps Pier. Here's the canyon structure offshore, which is responsible for a lot of the internal wave activity. And we had a lot of equipment deployed for 30 days, September to October 2014. Here's a temperature chain that we had out here. There's alongshore thermistors on the bottom, located here. And I've blown up the pier here because we had 44 instruments deployed on the pier, strapped to the pilings, to get a really good record of the cross-shore evolution of internal waves as they propagate into really, really shallow water. So let's talk about a couple of these observations. These are stacked temperature plots. This is depth versus time, and the color bar is temperature. And I've done these for a variety of different locations. This is at the 18-meter isobath, so down to about 16 meters was the lowest one we had. Here's at the end of the pier. This is in about 8 meters water depth, 6 meters water depth, all the way into about 2 meters water depth. And I want to highlight that these little pulses of blue here are the isotherms heaving up and down. And occasionally, if I blow this up, this is about 9 days here that we'll zoom in on. Sorry, this is about 3.5 days that we'll zoom in on. You can see the isotherms heaving up and down on 6-hour and 12-hour timescales. There's a lot of energy in this. This is the 10-meter. This isotherm is heaving up and down 10 meters at the 18-meter isobath. And I also want to highlight that these structures appear all the way inshore to about 2 meters water depth. So we'll look a little closer here. This is 9 hours that I'm highlighting from here to just emphasize that on top of this 6 and 12-hour variability, there's also really high frequency variability. This is about 10-minute period energy. That's also really energetic. This is also potentially interesting because this temperature here at the pier end is pretty well mixed going onshore. And we can note a progressive arrival time of this event kind of going onshore. And that's what we'd like to explore a little bit. So first, these are some qualitative observations. This is depth here versus cross-shore distance. So this is the shore, this is the pier end. And I'm showing you temperature again. All of these little dots are where we had thermistors. So we had observations of all of those black dots. And I objectively mapped the temperature here to show you what an event looks like as it progresses. So here we can see, here's the front arriving. This is the cold kind of tongue of the front. About 1 hour and 18 minutes later, this cold water has moved all the way up into very shallow water. And then a short time later, it's fallen back down. So this is kind of the story of this event. And we can kind of quantitatively evaluate what's happening by looking at bottom temperature at both the cross-shore and along-shore locations. So this top plot here is temperature. I've offset these by 0.1 degrees C just so you can see them, versus time in hours. This plot is for the across-shore locations, and this plot is for the along-shore locations. And I've colored them to correspond to the dots. So this red plot here, this red line, corresponds to the temperature that was observed at the pier end. This magenta dot here corresponds to the temperature that was observed here, etc. And so I want to highlight two things. I want to highlight in the closed dots here the progressive arrival time of this event as it came on shore. First at the pier end and then moving on shore. And I also want to highlight in open dots that there's kind of a temperature reduction in each of these observations, eventually kind of culminating on shore where there's no longer any temperature reduction that's like different from background variation. And so that's the run-up extent of this event. And we can also see in the alongshore array that the temperature progressed in kind of a south to north fashion, so that we can assign an onshore propagation speed, we can give an angle at the pier end, we can look at the onshore temperature reduction of this event, and we can look at the run-up extent of each of these events that we observe. We can do this for a variety of waves. There's dots here at the bottom that show kind of examples, location of where some of these events are that I'm going to look at. And I've plotted them here as a function of, this is the event front velocity and the angle of the events. So I'm just highlighting that there's a variety of velocities that were observed at the pier end and a variety of propagation angles from these events that were observed at the pier end. So this is nice, we have observations. But we'd like to apply this to something that we know about theory. And so we'll use a two-layer gravity current theory to try to explore what physics is happening with some of these events. This is an example of what a two-layer gravity current looks like. Here's water of one density and a lighter density. And when a boundary is removed between these two layers, the dense water flows underneath the light water at a certain velocity. And that velocity is given here, and it's related to things that we can measure. Things like the height of the gravity current, the depth of the water, and G prime is the reduced gravity, which is related to the density difference. So we can measure these things in the field as well, and we can relate the gravity current speed that we would predict to the actual observed speed of the front that we measure. And this is doing pretty well. So a gravity current is kind of a fair predictor, I guess, of what these events look like as they move past the pier end. I'm going to highlight 4 events and show you a little bit more about the onshore evolution of these 4 events, because that's one thing that we're after. So this is the pier end. This is distance from the pier end moving onshore. And this is time. So when the events were first observed at the pier end, that's this point. And at progressively later times, they were observed farther and farther onshore. That's what the dots are. And I've fit a quadratic to these dots, to each event. And what the quadratic gives is a deceleration of this front as it moves onshore. And so we can compare that to, again, two-layer theory, moving up a slope. And so that's what this is. This is a gravity current that's moving up a slope, decelerating as it goes. The deceleration of this gravity current is given over here, again, by things we can measure. Now, S is the slope of the bathymetry. And so these things we know, and so we can compare these observed waves with what we expect a gravity current would do up a slope. And these, again, are doing pretty well. So two-layer scalings are doing a pretty good job of predicting what these fronts are doing as they move on shore. And so finally, I'll summarize chapter 4. Here's our heat budget again. We were looking at the advective component this time, and in particularly internal waves. The internal waves we observed had large temperature fluctuations. They could be a degree C in about 5 minutes, even far on shore. They were coherently propagating upslope and at a variety of different angles and speeds. The two-layer gravity current scalings applied well to describe the upslope propagation of these events. And one thing I didn't mention, but I think I should point out, is that these properties of these events evolved self-similarly. That is, even though they might have different values, they evolved in predictable and consistent ways upslope. So, so that's kind of the summary of chapter 4. To remind you of the whole dissertation, we started with a surf zone heat budget. We closed a primitive surf zone heat budget on diurnal and monthly timescales. We quantified a new surf zone heat flux term, that was the wave heating flux, the wave energy dissipation in surf zone. In chapter 2, we explored how albedo might change the solar radiation component, and we made some of the first detailed surf zone albedo observations and developed 2 parameterizations, one image-based and one wave-based, to describe albedo in the surf zone. In chapter 3, we looked at the combined effects of the albedo reduction and the wave heating to the surf zone, and then generalized this for surf zones of other slopes and locations. And finally, in chapter 4, we looked at some observations of internal wave propagation into really shallow water, basically the internal run-up into the surf zone, or to the surf zone, and characterized some aspects of this upslope evolution. So what's next for me? I'm going to be doing a postdoc with Falk for a little while, looking at kind of the heat budget version 2.0. We have lots of data from all of these instruments, 70+ instruments, 9 months of data, and some new parameterizations to play with. So I think this will be really fruitful in describing the surf zone heat budget really accurately. And after that, I'm excited to look at internal waves on the inner shelf with Kristen Davis at UC Irvine. We're going to be doing this in Dongsha Atoll, which is a really unique location to study these waves. So I'm excited to see what fruit that bears as well. I have tons of people to thank for all of this stuff. Lots of people helped me with my own instrumentation, but as part of my time here, I was lucky enough to be involved in some other projects as well, Seaside, for instance, and the Inner Shelf DRI that happened last summer. It's been a tremendous experience, and so all of the folks in Falk's lab have been really supportive. I've learned a ton. It's been amazing. Lots of people lent me equipment, or lent me their data, or helped me fix their equipment. So thanks to all these people as well. Many divers helped me maintain this huge array in the surf zone. Surf zone diving is not usually glamorous, so sincerely thank you to folks who helped me do that. And of course to my classmates here at Scripps and abroad for really teaching me and helping me kind of understand more about my passion for oceanography. And also, I really want to thank my family and friends. It's been, well, my wife's a superhero, so thank you, I love you. Dave, my brother, was one of the people who introduced me to diving and started me on this process. So throughout, my family and friends have been both a motivating and a supporting influence in my career. So at that, I better get off and ask for questions. So thank you very much.
We open it up to questions.
Yeah, listen.
Thanks, Greg.
Yeah.
So I was curious about your getting at albedo from the images.
Yeah.
And so you showed this band of foam that you were able to kind of get at it. how did you zoom in on that band, and how sensitive is your parameterization to that band that you chose?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the process we used to do that is to take a whole pile of images that we could tell had foam. So we know that these ones have foam, put them all together, basically do an average of all of these images together. So we'll get a PDF of all of these images that we know have foam. And then the inflection points on either side of that curve is where we define that band. And that's been done for image processing in other applications before as a way to kind of isolate what's bright versus what's dark. So that's the method.
Hey, Greg.
Yeah.
Great talk. It's nice to see such a linear progression for it from the planet that way. In terms of the albedo thing, I'm just curious, do you give any thoughts in the sense that some of this increased upwelling light might actually have penetrated the surface and be backscattered from the sediment?
Yeah.
So that would actually be more of it might not be a loss as much as a possible addition to heating from greater chance of absorption.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the short answer to that question is that wet sand has an albedo of about 0.06. So it's very absorptive. So wet sand doesn't reflect much. It looks fairly dark. So there will be some reflected, but that light that's also reflected also penetrates the entire water column before it gets kind of released back out through the surface of the ocean. So that we believe is going to be a small component of the total albedo from the surface. Yeah.
It was a very nice talk.
Thanks.
How important are rip currents in the overall budget?
Yeah, so that's a good question as well. Hallie Rosendahl studied exchange using dye and could, on an average sense, quantify an exchange velocity of rip currents. And so that exchange velocity, let's see, is 10 to the -2 meters per second. So that's, on average, it's relatively small, but in a rip current, it's large. So from a heat budget perspective, I would say it's certainly an effective component to the heat budget. But that wasn't estimated here. We didn't have an ADCP on that first chapter to really look at that.
That's going to be something that Greg will be looking
Yeah,
at.
that's the 70+ instruments and heat budget version 2.0. So I'll have an answer for you within 6 months.
To follow up on that,
Yeah.
if you were to take a guess as to the signs of that term, the
Yeah.
current heat flux term
Yeah.
through the end of the period, what sign would it be?
Yeah, so here, this surf zone is usually cooler than the inner shell. So I'd expect the sign to be a positive sign because there's cooler water leaving the surf zone, replaced by warmer water from offshore. So I'd expect that to be, in general, the sign.
And can I ask another question? Sure. I was super surprised at the scalings. This is going back to the albedo. Super surprised that the scalings don't show a relationship between significant wave height and sort of total reflectance of the surf zone. Is that just because? I think that's what I heard. And so is that just because the fact that the surf zone width is changing with the significant wave height, so it kind of cancels out?
Yeah, these are surf zone averaged quantities.
Mm-hmm.
So if you increase the waves, you increase the width of the surf zone. Not all waves are breaking far out in the surf zone. So you have a smaller foam fraction in the outer portion of the surf zone than you do on the inner portion of the surf zone. So most waves are breaking on the inner portion of the surf zone. Fewer waves are breaking on the outer portion of the surf zone. You increase the width of the surf zone, you're increasing both parts of that surf zone. So on average, that cancels out.
Mm. Because it just seems like the wave heating and the albedo, you would guess before running through the parameterizations that they would be related, the more, significant wave height there is, the more albedo effect there would be as well. But that does not apparently.
Yes, it's, yeah.
How important are longshore currents?
Longshore currents. So potentially important on non-alongshore uniform beaches. This particular section of beach we're taking to be kind of alongshore uniform, so that on an average sense, like currents that move one way are balanced by currents that move the other way. So here we expect there to be not that much variation in the alongshore on an average sense.
Great talk. Thanks to do search zone heat budgets, like how much do they contribute to sort of like the overall ocean heat budget? What's the exchange there? Is it a fairly large effect?
Yeah, probably nil for the overall ocean heat budget. The surf zone's a minuscule component of the open ocean. But if you're studying exchange in the nearshore, like people often do, and you're trying to do it with a heat budget, then I believe the surf zone heat budget variation may play a role in that. Looking at the nearshore inner shelf surf zone interplay. Yeah. Question?
So in asking a reverse of that question, you haven't select observations during a very weird time locally. It was the marine heat wave sort of block period. Would you expect your results to be any different if you collected them during a more normal climatological period?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I'm going to pontificate. I guess I would say that the atmospheric component of the heat budget, the air sea fluxes, probably not, unless there were more or less clouds because the water was warmer. I don't know. I guess if the inner shelf were generally warmer, then the difference in heat between the surf zone and inner shelf might be reduced. So I guess the answer is I don't know. Yeah, Drew.
To follow up on Tasha's question, I know this is surf zone heat budget 2.0, but you showed in your fourth chapter about internal wave run-up, and you showed obviously that there's big signal, but you didn't show a calculation of heat flux through, for a particular event or average over time or whatever. And obviously, like as the blob changed, as the marine heat wave changed, that would affect stratification. You could potentially change that term a lot.
For sure.
So do you have yet a feel for, for some average stratification or for some event like the particular run up and run down event that you showed qualitatively, do you have a feel for what that is relative to the other terms? I know it's just a snapshot, but.
Yeah, so I want to hold off on that until I do the full heat budget, I guess. Yeah, I guess I'd be scared to put a number to that now without doing the full thing.
That's a good dodge. Don't worry, you're fine. No, I just want, hey, I'm not asking for the definitive answer. I'm just interested in your feel. Like, is this, or my feel is that it's order one. You don't say the same thing as me.
So I guess, to do the benefit thing, I guess temperature differences on the order of a couple degrees C with velocities on the order of 5 meters or 5 centimeters per second or so. So I guess that would set the order.
Yeah. It could be big, but you have to,
I'm sure
to know the run up and the run down.
Yes.
So that's that.
Yeah. So one thing I didn't talk about in that fourth chapter is the potential energy and potential mixing that's happening from these things.
Sure.
And so most of these run-up events are largely adiabatic. That is, they're not kind of leaving their signature up in the surf zone. A lot of that cold water is moving back offshore. So the heat flux that we're seeing due to these events is kind of on the time scale of the event itself and not persistent.
Yeah.
Although that's not always the case.
Yeah, and it may depend on significant wave height. Right. If you have more mixing. Yeah, it's really good.
Yeah.
How did your results tie back into your introduction, and what did you learn as far as bacterial die-off and gas exchange?
Yeah, sure. So when I said that that fecal indicator bacteria is killed by ultraviolet light, I think, let's see if I can do this. No, I don't have it. So the relationship between the fecal indicator bacteria lifetime and ultraviolet light is pretty stark. So a reduction in the available light energy in the search zone of this order of, say, 20% or so, which is what this albedo is, will make a change to the survivability of fecal indicator bacteria on the scale of days. So they might persist in the search zone a lot longer and populate much larger areas than you might otherwise think. So that's one kind of example of product life.
All right, well, if there's no further questions, then let's ask the non-committee members to leave, and then the committee will have a discussion with Greg.